Nammo Phat. Good morning. Thank you for joining me for our daily practice check-in. Listen, listen, listen. This beautiful sound calls us back to our true home. The first mindfulness training. Aware of the suffering caused by the destruction of life, I vow to cultivate compassion and learn ways to protect the lives of people, animals, plants, and minerals. I am determined not to kill, not to let others kill, and not to condone any act of killing in the world, in my thinking, or in my way of life. We're continuing with our reading of Ajahn Thanissaro's The Karma of Questions. So, as with any skill, there are definite steps along the road to mastery. And because the asking of a question is a type of karma, the questions you ask not only have to start with the issue of skill, they also have to be skillful, to approach the issue skillfully themselves. Each step in the Buddha's skill is thus defined by a set of questions that focus your attention and shape your thinking in the most strategic direction. In fact, the questions he recommends can be taken as a map to the practice. You start out with questions that assume a self, and use that assumption to motivate yourself to act more and more skillfully. Only when you reach an appropriate level of skill do the questions turn to deconstruct your sense of self, pinpointing the things you identify as yourself, and showing that they're not really you. When the act of self-identification runs out of options, it stops in mid-air, and the mind opens to freedom. So if you put the not-self teaching in its proper context, the regimen of questions, you'll see that it's not a dead-end answer to a dead-end question. Instead, it's a cutting-edge tool for bringing about liberation. To begin this regimen, the Buddha recommends that when you visit a teacher, the first questions to ask are these. What is skillful? What is unskillful? What, if I do it, will be for my long-term harm and suffering? Or what, if I do it, will be for my long-term well-being and happiness? Although these last two questions bring in the concepts of I and my, they aren't the focus of the inquiry. The focus is on doing, on developing skill, on using your concern for me and my well-being to train your actions toward true happiness. The Buddha's answers to these preliminary questions read like a course in wilderness survival. First come the do's and don'ts. A wilderness instructor will tell you, if a moose charges you, run. If a bear charges you, don't. The Buddha's corresponding do's and don'ts are 10 guidelines dealing with body, speech, and mind. The guidelines for the body are, don't kill, don't steal, don't engage in illicit sex. For speech, don't tell lies, don't speak divisively, don't speak abusively, don't engage in idle chatter. And for the mind, abandon greed, abandon ill will, cultivate right views. These are the Buddha's basic ground rules for the survival of your happiness, and many of his teachings simply elaborate on these 10 points. But as any wilderness instructor will tell you, survival requires more than simple rules of thumb. You have to be alert to the gaps not covered by the rules. You need to learn to use your powers of observation, imagination, and ingenuity to dig out unskillful habits and develop new habits to fill in the gaps. That way you can live comfortably in the wilderness, respectful of the bears and moose and other dangers around you, without being overwhelmed by them. The same holds true with the Buddha's skill. In addition to following the do's and don'ts, you have to learn how to dig out the roots of unskillful behavior so that you can become adept in all areas of your life, including the areas where the do's and don'ts don't apply. The roots of unskillful behavior are three: greed, anger, and delusion. Of the three, delusion is the most insidious, for it blinds you to its very existence. The only way to overcome it is to be relentlessly observant, looking at your actions in terms of cause and effect, gauging their short and long-term consequences for yourself and others. Again, this involves learning to ask the right questions. Each time you're about to act, ask yourself, this action that I want to do, would it lead to self-harm, to the harm of others, or to both? Is it an unskillful action with painful consequences, painful results? If you foresee harm, don't follow through with it. If not, go ahead and act. While acting, ask yourself if there are any unexpected bad consequences arising. If there are, stop. If there aren't, continue with what you're doing. When the action is done, look into its actual short and long-term consequences. If an action in word or deed has ended up causing harm, inform an experienced fellow practitioner on the path. This is why the Buddha established the Sangha, and listen to that person's advice. If the mistaken action was purely an act of the mind, try to develop distaste for that kind of thinking. In both cases, resolve never to make the same mistake again, and use your ingenuity to make the resolve stick. If, however, the long-term consequences of the original action were harmless, take joy and satisfaction in being on the right path and continue your training. May all beings be well. May all beings be happy. May all beings be peaceful. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you for joining me this morning.